Smell hit me first. Cigarette smoke and something fried. Bacon maybe, or sausage, hanging in the air of a house that had been non-smoking for 32 years. I stood on the front step of my own home on Birchwood Crescent and told myself I was imagining things. 7 months away will do that to a person. You start to misremember the small details. The way the light falls through the kitchen window in the afternoon. The particular creak of the second porch step. But I wasn't misremembering the smell. I'd driven 4 hours from Sudbury without stopping, which wasn't smart for a woman my age with a bad hip and a thermos of cold coffee. But I hadn't been able to sleep the night before, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, I decided I just needed to go home. My son Nathan had been calling less frequently. His texts had gotten shorter. The last one, 4 days ago, was just, "Things are fine, Mom, don't worry." Nathan has never once in his 34 years told me not to worry without there being something worth worrying about. My husband Dennis had passed in October. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much time to argue with it. We'd gone to his sister's place in Sudbury right after the diagnosis because she was a retired nurse, and Dennis had wanted familiar faces around him at the end. I planned to be gone 6 weeks. 6 weeks turned into 7 months because grief doesn't follow a schedule, and because his sister Phyllis had needed me too, and because every time I thought about coming back to an empty house, I found another reason to stay just a little longer. But Nathan was my reason to come home. He always had been. I tried my key. It worked, which was something. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. A woman I had never seen in my life was standing in my kitchen. She was maybe 40, heavy-set, wearing a housecoat that I recognized as one of the ones I'd left hanging on the back of the bathroom door. She was holding a mug, my mug, the ceramic one Nathan had bought me at the Stratford Festival 15 years ago, and she was looking at me with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite guilt, more like mild inconvenience. "Can I help you?" she said. I've replayed that moment many times since. Can I help you? In my own kitchen, standing on the mat where my husband used to leave his boots. "I live here," I said. I was proud of how calm my voice came out. "Who are you?" She set the mug down and crossed her arms. "I'm Renata. I'm staying here with my husband." "You're staying here with your husband," I repeated. "Kevin's family," she said, like that explained everything. Kevin. My daughter-in-law Sylvie's younger brother. I knew the name. I'd met him twice at family gatherings. Quiet, a little sullen, the kind of young man who always seemed to be waiting for something better to come along. I had not invited Kevin or his wife Renata to stay in my home. "Where is Nathan?" I asked. Something moved across her face then. Not guilt exactly, discomfort. "He's at work," she said. "And Sylvie?" "At her mother's for the week." I nodded slowly. I looked around my kitchen. There were dishes in the sink, not one meal's worth but several days' worth, stacked carelessly. An ashtray on my kitchen table that had not been there in October. A child's shoe on the counter next to the fruit bowl. I looked at the fruit bowl and saw it had no fruit in it, just a set of keys I didn't recognize, and a folded receipt from a place in Barrie. I walked past Renata without another word. The living room had a pull-out couch that hadn't been pulled out when I left because we didn't use it that way. It was a guest couch for the occasional overnight, not meant to be slept in nightly. It had been slept in, the sheets were rumpled, and there were 2 pillows with no cases on the floor. A portable heater was plugged into the wall, running, even though it was April and the house had its own furnace that worked perfectly well. I went down the hall. The main bathroom, wet towels on the floor, 3 different toothbrushes on the counter, a child's bath toys in the tub. The medicine cabinet was open, and half the things in it weren't mine. Dennis's study, the second bedroom, the one he'd used as an office for 20 years. The door was slightly open. I pushed it and saw a room that had been rearranged entirely. Dennis's desk was pushed against the wall. His bookshelves, the ones with his engineering texts and his Clive Cussler novels and the framed photographs of our fishing trips to Georgian Bay, had been moved to make room for a child's mattress on the floor, toys scattered around it, a portable DVD player running some cartoon with the sound off. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I kept walking. My bedroom. The master bedroom, the room where Dennis and I had slept for 27 years. The door was closed. I could hear sounds from inside. A television. I opened the door. A man I assumed was Kevin was lying on my bed watching a hockey game on the television Dennis had mounted on the wall 2 Christmases ago. He sat up when I came in. He was younger than I'd expected from Sylvie's stories, maybe 30, with the kind of face that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be yet. "Oh," he said. "You must be Nathan's mom." "I must be," I said. "And this is my room." He had the grace to look embarrassed at least. He swung his legs off the bed and stood up. "Sylvie said you weren't coming back until June." "Sylvie was wrong. Where's my son?" "Like Renata said, he's working. He'll be back around 6. I looked at my room. My things were still there, mostly. My dresser, my photographs on the wall, the quilt my mother had made, but pushed aside, made into a backdrop for someone else's occupancy. Their clothes were folded on top of my cedar chest. A phone charger snaked across my nightstand. "I need you to call Nathan," I said, "right now." He did. To his credit, he handed me the phone without arguing. "Mom?" Nathan's voice. Immediately I could hear it. The tight, careful quality of a person who has been managing something they didn't know how to talk about. "You're here?" "I'm here," I said. "Come home." He was there in 40 minutes. He drove a flooring installation route and had been in Wasaga Beach all day. I sat at my kitchen table and drank a cup of tea that I made myself, and Renata took the child, a girl of about 4 who appeared from somewhere and stared at me with enormous eyes and retreated to Dennis's study. Kevin went with them. The apartment went quiet in the way that a place goes quiet when people are still in it but pretending very hard not to be. Nathan came through the door and looked at me, and I could see 7 months of something collapse across his face. He was thinner. That was the first thing. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. His jaw was sharper. His cheeks had a hollowed quality. He sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table, and didn't say anything for a moment. "How long?" I asked. "Since February," he said. February. 2 months after Dennis died. 2 months after I was still sitting in Phyllis's spare room working through the paperwork for a death that had come slightly less unexpectedly than a truck accident, but no less brutally. "Start at the beginning," I said. What came out was this. Kevin and Renata had lost their apartment in Barrie in January. Not from anything dramatic. Their landlord had sold the building and they'd been given notice to move. Legal notice, all above board. But they hadn't saved enough, and the rental market in Barrie had gotten bad, and Sylvie had offered to let them stay for just a few weeks until they got sorted. She hadn't asked Nathan. She'd just told him the night before they arrived with their daughter and their bags and their portable heater. And Nathan had said yes because he didn't know how to say no to Sylvie's family, and because it was only supposed to be a few weeks. A few weeks became 2 months and then 2.5. "In your room?" I said, though part of me already knew. He looked at the table. I'd seen enough. I got up and walked down the hall again. I knocked on the door of what was supposed to be the guest room, the room Nathan and Sylvie used for overnight guests, with the daybed and the small wardrobe. Nathan was right behind me. I opened the door. The daybed had been pushed to the wall. On the floor, in the corner of the room, was an air mattress, one of those cheap ones from Canadian Tire already slightly deflated, and on it was a folded sleeping bag and a pillow. Nathan's pillow, the one he'd had since he was a teenager, a dark blue pillowcase worn soft from years of washing. On the windowsill, Nathan's alarm clock, his book, his reading glasses. Tucked under the air mattress, barely visible, a pair of his slippers. My son had been sleeping on an air mattress on the floor of his own guest room for 2 months, in his own house, the house that Dennis and I had given him the down payment for. I stood there for a long time. I've raised 2 children. I've buried a husband. I've sat in hospital waiting rooms and lawyers' offices and school principals' offices, and I've learned that the moments that break you open are never the big dramatic ones. They're always the small things. The sleeping bag, the pillow, the reading glasses on the windowsill because there's no nightstand to put them on. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down. Nathan stood in the doorway looking like a child again, which he hadn't looked like in 30 years. "Call Sylvie," I said. "Mom, Nathan. Call your wife." She called back within 5 minutes. I could hear her voice through the phone, bright and placating, explaining how it was temporary, how Kevin was this close to getting a new place, how the rental market in Barrie was just brutal right now. I listened to about 30 seconds of it, and then I asked Nathan to put her on speaker. "Sylvie," I said, "I'm in my house. Your brother and his family are in my house. My son is sleeping on an air mattress. Silence. This arrangement ends, I said. I want everyone out in 2 weeks. That's 14 days, which is more than fair notice and more than I'm legally required to give. But I'm giving it because I'm not unreasonable. After that, I will be calling the Barrie Housing Authority and the OPP if necessary. Sandra, Sylvie started. 2 weeks, I said. Not negotiable. I handed the phone back to Nathan and went to check whether anyone had thought to water my plants while I was gone. They hadn't. The peace lily on the windowsill was so desiccated it looked almost sculptural. I ran a glass of water for it and stood at the sink looking out at my backyard, at Dennis's tomato cages still standing where he'd left them, at the bird feeder that needed filling. I called my lawyer the next morning. I'd used the same firm in Collingwood for 30 years, and the woman I spoke with, a sharp woman named Allison who'd seen a lot of human behavior in her career, walked me through the situation calmly. As the sole owner of the property, Dennis had added my name to the deed years ago and the mortgage had been paid off in 2019. I was within my rights. 2 weeks was actually more than I needed to give. She advised me to document everything and to keep a written record of any communication with Kevin and Renata from this point forward. Have they been paying rent? She asked. No, I said. Any signed agreement? None. Then you're fine. Send the formal notice in writing today. Just to be thorough, I'll have my assistant draw something up. I drove to the copy place in town and printed it and brought it back and slid it under the door of what had been Dennis's study. Kevin opened the door and looked at it and then looked at me. We can't find a place in 2 weeks, he said. I understand it's difficult, I said. The housing market is hard everywhere right now. But that's not something I'm able to solve for you. He looked at me for a long moment. Whatever he saw in my face apparently settled the matter because he nodded once and closed the door. The next thing I found out by accident. I was looking for the folder of house insurance documents. Dennis always kept them in the filing cabinet in the living room, and the filing cabinet was locked. I hadn't locked it. I didn't even know there was a key for it. I found the key eventually in a tea tin on the kitchen counter, and when I opened the cabinet, most of what I needed was still there, but something had been moved. The property file, the mortgage documents, the deed, the tax records had been taken out of its usual hanging folder and set flat at the bottom of the drawer. I took it out and sat down. Everything was there. Except tucked in behind the deed was a piece of paper I didn't recognize. It was a letter on what looked like bank letterhead, though when I looked more carefully I could see the logo was slightly off. The spacing was wrong, the font not quite right. It was addressed to a name I didn't know, referring to the property on Birchwood Crescent, and it appeared to be, I had to read it 3 times to be sure, some sort of informal letter of confirmation of tenancy signed at the bottom with a signature that was not mine or Dennis's and not Nathan's. I photographed it with my phone. I called Allison back. Bring it in, she said, and her voice had changed register in a way that told me this was serious. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it down. This isn't legally binding, she said. The property documentation overrides any informal letter, and this isn't notarized, it's not witnessed properly, and frankly, it looks fabricated. But I want you to understand, someone created this document. That's not nothing. Kevin? I asked. I can't say. But someone did. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The tulips Dennis had planted along the front walk were coming up, which they would do with or without anyone to appreciate them, because tulips are reliable like that. I thought about Dennis. About what he would have said. He was not a dramatic man. He would have looked at all of this and said something like, "Well, let's just sort it out then." So I sorted it out. I called the non-emergency line for the OPP and asked them, calmly, what my rights were as a property owner with guests who had overstayed. The officer was courteous and thorough. He explained the process, confirmed that the written notice I'd already given was appropriate, and when I mentioned the document, his tone sharpened slightly. "You might want to bring that to the attention of the Financial Crimes Unit," he said. "Not necessarily for criminal charges right away, but it should be on record." It went on record. Nathan had a harder 2 weeks than I did, I think. He was the one living in the house with the silence and the tension. He called me every evening, and I could hear him moving through the rooms, quieter than he used to be, more careful. I'd check in. "Are you eating? Is the heat on?" He'd answer, and then we'd talk about other things. About Dennis, sometimes about small things, about what I wanted to plant in the garden in May. Those phone calls mattered more than I could say. Renata was cold to me for the entire 2 weeks. She moved through the common spaces with the deliberate carefulness of someone making a point. Kevin, to his credit, was practical and not unkind. He made arrangements. He asked once whether they could have an extra week, and I said no. Politely but clearly. Their daughter left finger paintings on the refrigerator door that she'd done at preschool, and I kept them there until they left because they were not her fault. On the 14th day, they loaded a rented pickup truck and drove away. Nathan watched from the front window. I was in the kitchen. I put the kettle on, and then I went and found the good mugs, the ones from the Stratford Festival, the ones that had somehow survived 7 months and a full occupation, and I made 2 cups of tea. We sat at the kitchen table, Nathan and I, the same table where Dennis had eaten breakfast every morning for 27 years, and we didn't say much for a while. "I should have called you," Nathan said. "Yes," I said. "You should have. I didn't want to bother you." "You were all ready, Nathan." I set down my mug. "I am your mother. Bothering me is allowed. Bothering me is the point." He smiled, finally. It was a tired smile, but it was real. Over the following weeks, I put the house back in order. I moved Dennis's books back to the shelves where they belonged. I got the air mattress out of the guest room and folded it up and put it in the basement, where it could have a normal life being used for camping. I filled the bird feeder. I planted tomatoes in the cages Dennis had left. The Financial Crimes Unit did follow up on the document. The investigation is ongoing, which is all I can say with certainty. What I can say is that what they found when they looked into Kevin's history was not nothing. There had been a similar situation, less documented, with a landlord in Barrie 2 years earlier. Allison told me I had handled the whole thing exactly right. "Most people in your position either escalate too fast or don't escalate at all," she said. "You were measured." I told her I'd learned from Dennis. He had always believed in being measured. He believed in knowing what you were owed and asking for it clearly and not making it ugly unless it had to be ugly. I think about Renata standing in my kitchen in my housecoat holding my mug. I don't think about it with anger anymore. I think about it as the moment I understood that grief will make you absent in ways that other people will walk through if you let them. I had let myself be absent too long. Not from Phyllis, not from caring for Dennis, that I don't regret for a single day, but from my own life, my own house, my son, who had needed me and hadn't known how to say so. I'm home now. The peace lily came back. It took about 3 weeks of regular water and moving it to a better light spot by the east window, but it came back. It's sitting there right now, actually, full and green, and every morning when I come downstairs and put the kettle on, I look at it and think, well, stubborn things survive. So do we. I've been thinking about what actually made any of this possible. Not the legal letter, not the phone calls, not Allison's advice, though all of that mattered. What made it possible was that I came home. That sounds simple. It isn't. Grief does something to your sense of proportion. It narrows your world down to the immediate, the next meal, the next appointment, the next difficult phone call. And somewhere in those 7 months in Sudbury, I had stopped asking the right questions about Nathan. Not because I didn't care, because I was tired and sad and it was easier to believe him when he said things were fine. I chose the comfortable answer. And that choice had a cost, just not one I was the one paying. I think about Kevin and Renata sometimes, and I try to be fair about it. They needed a place, and Sylvie offered one that wasn't hers to offer, and they accepted without asking too many questions about whose house it actually was. That's a moral failure. But it's also a recognizable one. People in difficult situations will accept a solution that works for them, especially if the door is left open. The door was left open because Nathan didn't know how to close it, and the door was left open that long because I wasn't there to see it. What I did when I came home wasn't remarkable. I asked questions. I made calls. I put things in writing. I said no, clearly and without apology, and I held the line when I was asked to move it. None of that required courage in the way people sometimes talk about courage. The dramatic kind, the kind that happens all at once. It just required showing up, being present, and trusting that I was allowed to expect basic decency in my own home. Dennis would have called that common sense. He'd be right, but I've learned that common sense is harder to access when you're grieving and exhausted and trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. Grief teaches you to shrink. Coming back is an act of will. What I understand now, that I didn't fully understand before, the people who love us need us present, not just available. Nathan didn't need me to call from Sudbury and ask if things were fine. He needed me at the kitchen table, looking at his face, noticing that he was thinner. There is no substitute for being physically actually there. I had told myself I was sparing him by staying away, by managing my grief quietly in someone else's spare room. I wasn't sparing him. I was leaving him to manage on his own. The document Kevin had put in the filing cabinet, the one that looked like bank letterhead and wasn't. That investigation is still running its course. I can't say more than that. What I can say is that the moment I stopped accepting the surface version of things and started asking what was actually underneath, the whole picture changed. That's true of the filing cabinet, and it's true of everything else. The truth doesn't disappear when you're not looking at it. It just waits. Nathan comes for dinner every Sunday now. We've started fixing up the garden together, the two of us, working through Dennis's old plans for the raised beds he never got to build. We don't talk about the 7 months much. We don't need to. We're both just glad to be in the same room. The peace lily is still on the windowsill. Still green, stubborn things survive.